What's up, Inside Gamers? It's your favorite new boy, Evan Campbell, aka Lord Burrito, aka the terrible one. Well, it finally happened. Sony finally came out and dropped all the specs for the up-and-coming PlayStation 5. Not to be outdone, Microsoft swooped in just beforehand and also provided some more specific details for their Xbox Series X. Now that we know what's inside both the Series X and the PS5, there are so many technical details, small and large, to pour over and compare for the next couple of months. But ultimately, it's all kind of just kindling for the raging fire that is the console wars. Now, this video may very well contribute to that eternal flame, but what I hope to accomplish today is to provide a quick technical breakdown of the differences between the Xbox Series X and the PS5, and then talk about some of the differences between the consoles that aren't reliant on tech. And sure, I'll even talk a little bit about which console I think is winning the console war, whatever that means. Full disclosure, I love video games. It doesn't matter what console or platform it's on. If someone says a game is good, I want to play it. Now, that doesn't mean I don't have subjective opinions about games or consoles. It just means I'll certainly be buying both the PS5 and the Series X at launch, and I'm very excited. So let's talk about them. You can head over to one of many great tech sites and find a pretty quick breakdown of the differences hardware-wise between the PS5 and the Series X. Today I'm using the one from Digital Foundry, who've just always been incredible at tech reporting. All right, let's jump in. At the top of the chart, we have the specs for CPU and GPU performance. With a quick glance, we see the numbers on the Xbox side are larger with the 8 Zen 2 cores at 3.8 gigahertz, and of course the infamous 12.16 teraflops, which Microsoft has boasted in the past. But what is a teraflop, and why does it matter?
Teraflops is defined as the computational capability of the vector ALU.
Thanks, Mark. Actually, jokes aside, Mark Cerny is an incredible human who, during his Road to PS5 talk, made a really good point for why it might not matter that the Xbox One Series X has more flops. Essentially, for the PS5, they've changed the architecture for the GPU to allow it to clock at higher speeds to make it more efficient and potentially a bit quieter. Note the 2.23 gigahertz to the Xbox's 1.825 gigahertz over here on the chart. Remember the story about how Sony was spending more on cooling for the PS5? Well, this is the reason. The idea is that they will boost the clock speed of the GPU and the CPU running simultaneously as needed by constantly feeding the console a generous amount of power, as Mark Cerny says. This means your fan isn't going to kick on suddenly during that intense boss fight or whatever, because the amount of power consumption is consistent. By increasing the clock speeds, Cerny is implying that they will free up other aspects of processing bandwidth to deliver similar or better results without as many teraflops. Next up, we have the GPU architecture. Both consoles are using AMD's custom RDNA 2 architecture, and there are a couple of takeaways here. Firstly, this architecture is customizable, so Sony and Microsoft might be able to do some interesting things and very different things. For example, Sony spent a great deal of time talking about the PS5's all-new approach to audio, which is kind of wild. I mean, they're taking digital images of people's ears and creating audio profiles for your headphones. It's really cool. The RDNA 2 architecture also means that both consoles will support AMD's version of ray tracing, which I'm also pretty excited about. I know ray tracing doesn't seem like that big of a deal to a lot of us, but for people making games, I think it's actually kind of a large game changer, and I think just a normal part of every gaming experience eventually. The last thing to note about this particular line item is it has to do with how the new consoles will handle backward compatibility, not just for games of last generation, but moving forward into the next generation as well, right? I should note here that although RDNA 2 architecture makes it easier for backwards compatibility, Sony did say since there's such a huge boost in performance in the PS5 caused by the new CUs and the GPU and the new SSD, that some games code just doesn't hold up and will have to be updated or made compatible. But he assured us that up to almost 100 of the most played games on PS4 will likely or should likely be compatible at launch, which is pretty cool. If the Series X comes out with the full Game Pass library or whatever, it's not going to compete with that. Or if it comes baked in with the already accessible backwards compatible games, it's not going to compete, but it's a start. For RAM, there's not much to see here, both weighing in at 16 gigs of GDDR6 random access memory, but we can easily see with the memory bandwidth column that both consoles will be accessing and allocating their RAM quite a bit differently. While the PS5 is pretty straightforward with a constant rate of 448 gigs per second, the Xbox Series X has its RAM divided into two chunks, in which 10 gigs of it is over 100 gigs per second faster than the PS5 at 560 gigabytes per second, but then 6 gigabytes of it is 100 gigabytes slower at 336 gigabytes per second. The reason for this is because the Xbox is designating that smaller chunk of memory to handle the Xbox's OS, inputs, maybe controller inputs and audio, those sorts of things, while the faster portion or the optimal memory is for graphics processing. processing. This is probably a good time to mention that Microsoft released a lot of details about how they are also trying to improve input latency, and it has to do with the entire structure of how everything is laid out, and also a complete rewrite of their previous method for handling controller inputs. Also related is how Xbox Series X will be able to suspend multiple games at once. That has to do with the GPU and the CPU and the way things are placed and the way that like the RAM is divided. Sony didn't talk about this side of the PS5 really suspending multiple games or anything like that, or input latency at all, but he did spend a ton of time talking in general about how the PS5 is using new and unique ways to really optimize performance. I think both consoles are similar in this way. 16 gigs of RAM really isn't that much when it comes to like a pro gaming rig, and yeah, I think you can make a pretty strong argument you don't need more than that if you're just playing games, but with what we've learned about how the PS5 and the Series X are being built, they're going to be able to do some very, very cool things with just 16 gigs of RAM. All right, let's move on to something that we all understand quite well. Internal storage. How many games are we going to be able to fit on these things? Well, that particular question will hinge on how big next-gen games are going to be, but here again, we have the Xbox Series X with 1 terabyte of internal SSD storage, outclassing the PS5 with its 825 gigs of SSD storage. Solid-state drives are going to be a thing. In terms of getting more storage on your PS5 or your Xbox Series X, the PS5 will allow you to expand your internal storage with a port for an additional SSD. According to Sony, they're working to make sure that popular M2 SSD drives will be compatible with the PS5, as long as their speed, spec, and physical footprint are compatible, but he suggests waiting until everyone sorts their shit out before you rush out and buy one. The upside is you could potentially find a range of M2 drives at different sizes and prices, which is always nice. You know, like if you don't want to put a full terabyte in there, you can only afford like 500 gigs at the time. It's kind of cool to have that option. The Xbox Series X also allows for expansion, but the only drive announced is a proprietary 1 terabyte expansion card. Well, actually, it's made by Seagate, and it's described, you know, by a lot of websites as a specialized drive, but you can imagine it probably won't be cheap, and there probably won't be many, if any, competitors at all to knock the price down. Both consoles will support external USB hard drives, which is great for storing your games, but if you want to play them, you'll have to move them over to your SSD. It's just because the solid state drive is such a boost in performance, and it's like so far above and beyond what a regular hard drive can do. Both of these solid state drives are configured specifically for the consoles that they're in. So the PS5 one is configured specifically for the PS5, and the Xbox Series X is configured specifically for the Xbox Series X. That proprietary 1 terabyte expansion card you put in your Series X is going to perform just as well as the internal SSD, according to what they've shared with everybody on these tech sites and things. The one stat that the PS5 does undeniably crush the Xbox Series X on is the I/O throughput, which is how fast internal drives can transfer data. The PS5 is rocking 5.5 gigabytes per second raw and 8 to 9 gigabytes per second compressed, while the Xbox Series X is about half of that at 2.4 gigabytes raw per second and 4.8 gigabytes compressed. It's wild that these numbers are so different, but I'd be surprised to see how much difference this makes given what each company is saying about their hardware. But at the same time, these SSDs are really what are going to set these new consoles apart from their predecessors. So since the PS5's throughput is twice as fast, it could mean stuff like faster load times and faster asset streaming, reducing things like pop-in. It could even make it easier to lock in more impressive frame rates potentially, because if it's able to load and process assets faster, then that's just a thing that allows you to kind of have better performance in your game, right? But then again, both of these consoles are all about polish and efficiency. They're kind of redefining how games go from being lines of code to transforming into these experiences on our screen, right? So for example, the architecture of the Xbox Series X is said to give developers access to 100 gigs worth of game assets at any given time using what they're calling the velocity architecture within the Xbox Series X. So maybe that makes up the difference. I don't really know. It'll be interesting to see how these things kind of play out as we see how launch games perform and things like that. It really is incredible from a hardware perspective what these boxes are going to be able to do, especially given their form factors and constraints, like trying to keep everything at a low price for retail. And you know, we saw some stories about that with the PS5, but you know, they still are arguably trying to keep these boxes under $500, I'm sure. So it's my feeling that even if you had a PC with similar hardware specs of this, you wouldn't be able to get the same type of performance out of it just because of how specifically these boxes are doing really weird things with their architecture to make games run faster, to be able to like read what's on a disk faster, read what's in a hard drive faster. They're innovating like the way that games are played just completely behind the scenes in a weird way that's gonna do things like eliminate load times and things. I mean, until they, you know, whatever developers push the threshold so far that, you know, now we're just waiting for load times because the games are all 4K or whatever. But, you know, that's a discussion for another time. Moving on, the last 3 rows kind of worth mentioning here are identical, with both consoles supporting Blu-ray disc drives, HDMI 2.1 support, and backwards compatibility, which we already talked about a bit. but the next really valuable bits of information we won't know until launch dates and launch lineups and prices are all announced. And I'd be surprised if the Xbox One X is much cheaper than the PS5 given the specs. It might come down to SKUs in terms of, base models versus pro models. I think we're going to see that. And if we don't see it at launch, we're definitely going to see it happen again halfway through the launch cycle, probably in 3 to 4 years or something like that. Maybe sooner, maybe even shorter. I'd love to see a cheaper pro model of either console though without a Blu-ray disc drive. I know a lot of people like their physical games, but I've kind of just run out of space for my game collection. And now I'm just like collecting classics more or less, and the new stuff I've just kind of all been downloading it. All things considered, the PS5 might actually prove to be just as capable, if not more capable, than the Xbox Series X, given if what Mark Cerny told us is true and holds up and everything goes according to plan and the PS5 functions like they're saying it's going to function. However, where Sony has really failed and continues to fail is marketing and messaging. It feels like they're a Hollywood teenager reluctant to get out of bed when it comes to talking about their next console. They've really messed this up bad. Like, who announces a logo at CES? I mean, look at Jim Ryan here. He literally looks like he just rolled out of bed to introduce Mark Cerny. It sucks that everyone who seemingly had a hand in the successful launch of the PS4 is gone. All the top level shakeups that happened, months ago, and even before then, I think, has me convinced that no one actually has their hand on the PS5 wheel, which is why we got Cerny doing a GDC talk as a PS5 reveal. I mean, I'd be pissed if I was Mark Cerny. You're working hard on this new console, and your parent company just doesn't even seem like they care. New consoles are a big deal, and Sony is treating it like another TV or a phone or something. It's awful. It just feels really bad. There's no corporate face or voice for the PS5. It's a real problem, especially compared to the charismatic nature of Phil Spencer or even Doug Bowser. Despite the mismanagement at the top level of Sony and their complete lack of connection with their audience, Sony is architecting what seems to be an incredible piece of technology. It seems really cool to me. But frankly, I think the PS5 has already lost the console war by a long shot in terms of market share, in terms of hearts and minds, and even perceived power on a technical level, despite Cerny's best efforts. It's about persistence and presence and presentation, showing you actually care about games and ushering in a new generation. Microsoft has been at it for at least a year, probably two. Go back and listen to Phil Spencer's 2019 Giant Bomb interview. It's incredible. There's no mistake about what they're trying to do and what they're trying to achieve with their approach to hardware design, their approach to game makers, their approach to getting new games on their boxes. And that was like almost a year ago. So it's wild that some Sony fans have waited for at least 2 years, and what they got was the road to PS5, which, don't get me wrong, I absolutely and unironically loved it because it's one of the most informative and pleasant presentations about a console I've ever seen in my life. But the takeaway for the majority of console buyers out there was, this guy's boring, PS5's only got 10 teraflops, rip Sony. But listen closely to what I'm about to say next. Losing or winning the console war isn't everything. If you ask me what console I think will sell better, I'd say the Xbox Series X. If you ask me what console is going to provide a better value, again, it's probably going to be the Xbox Series X with a Game Pass subscription. If you ask me what's going to have some really cool games at launch or exclusives, again, with Microsoft buying up all of those studios and they're all presumably working on some kind of Xbox Series X project, it's going to be the Series X. But if you ask me which console I think is going to be better, I don't know. That sort of thing is determined after a console's lifespan. I think a lot about the Dreamcast, and I try to think about what people were saying when it came out, and then when it was abruptly discontinued 2 years and 3 months later. It certainly didn't sell as many units as a PlayStation 2, or the GameCube, or even the Xbox, but it is still such an important part of our history, and there were so many great games on it. Combine that sentiment with what the Switch has been able to accomplish this gen with an incredible disadvantage in power, and it's more than clear the winner of the console wars can't be determined really at all, and it certainly can't be determined before consoles lived out its life. The upside is we all win when great games come out. I hope we all learned something about ourselves today. If not, I don't blame you. I'm a big dummy myself, so not learning things is kind of my specialty. Either way, we'll be live streaming on roosterteeth.com all week, so come by and say hi. Also, be sure to check out our new podcast, Send News, comes out every Friday. Thanks for watching, and let me know in the comments which console you're looking forward to the most and which next-gen games you can't wait to play. Or maybe you have a genius idea for a new feature for a console. Let me know. And lastly, thanks for sticking around with us through all the social isolation and the quarantine stuff. We're going to be doing our best to produce the daily and all our other content. As usual, we're working out some kinks as we go through it. So hang in there, and thanks for watching.
Yeah, just a couple days after Microsoft showed off the guts of the Xbox Series X, Sony was not to be outdone, so they held a special live stream today to finally give us some more details about their next-gen console.
Yeah, Sony's been a little behind Microsoft when it comes to talking about their newest machine, but they tried to make up for it today. So let's talk about what we learned, Brian.
Oh boy, so